One important reason why double-edged symmetrical swords were so useful to medieval knights. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatorian. Now you will have noticed if you've looked at medieval arms and armour and pictures of medieval warfare over the years that the symmetrical cross-hilted sword was extremely popular in medieval Europe. But of course there were other designs of sword, and some of them are single-edged and some of them are not symmetrical. But there's one really important reason why symmetrical double-edged swords work so well for someone who is wearing armour and wearing heavy equipment, facial protection especially in front of the face, even nasals and large shields. And that is, it doesn't matter which way you pull the sword out. Now what do I mean by that? Well, anyone who's done reenactment or fought in armour, indeed a lot of HEMA people who've just fought in heavy padded HEMA gear with fencing masks on, if you've ever experimented with switching weapons mid-combat, you will know that there is a very important consideration given to the design of weapons as to how easy they are to access and pull out. You could transfer this information in the modern world to things like the way that magazines and pulls, Magpul for example, are designed to get magazines out for quick magazine changes, or indeed the way that holsters for pistols are worn, where they're worn, and how the pistol grip is designed and things like this. Quick access. So I think oftentimes people think about these weapons as being ready and in your hand, but remember that the sword was often a backup that you want to get out at quick, short notice, because your primary weapon is something else. If you're an archer, it's a bow, crossbowman, obviously crossbow. If you're a knight fighting on foot, you might be using a poleaxe or a lance or spear on foot, or some other large weapon. And of course, if you're on horseback, the lance is your primary weapon and the sword's backup. So not always, but very often the sword's the backup weapon, and therefore accessing it and making sure that it works reliably is really, really important. Therefore, a sword that it doesn't matter which way out it comes is really, really important. Now, if we look at Japanese swords, for example, the katana was always worn edge up, so you always know in your mind that the edge is always upwards if it's worn through the sash. And indeed the tachi was worn hung edge down, so when you pull it out you know the edge is always downwards. However, because of the way that medieval swords were often worn, and even if we go back into the early medieval period, the so-called Dark Ages, the way that swords were worn often meant that when you pull them out, you don't necessarily know which way round they're pointing. Now, if you've got a symmetrical grip, your hand can't feel which way round it is, and therefore it could be either way round, so it's really useful to have two sharp edges. So it doesn't matter, you're not going to hit them with a blunt back, which of course can happen with a one-handed sword. If I just dispense with the... In fact, I'll keep the helmet on because we're going to come back to helmets in a second. Now, if we take something like the falchion, which is another popular type of sword used in the medieval period, then clearly these are single-edged and they are not symmetrical. But very often we start to get elements on the design of the hilt which easily differentiate which way round they are. In this case, I literally can't hold it the other way around because it's got a knuckle bone. You'll notice that the guard has a completely different shape on one side to the other. But moreover, we've got this thing here called a nagel, as the Germans call it, or nail. Sometimes we have other forms of projection. Sometimes it's a full bar, sometimes it's a little shell. On the German Langmesser, it's often a little projecting lug, much like this, or sometimes a little shell shape. And I think a lot of times people think about that in terms of the additional hand protection it confers. But there's another point. If you don't have the knuckle bone here and you've got an otherwise symmetrical hilt, I'll just go back to the arming sword for a second. If you've got an otherwise symmetrical hilt, then when you pull it out without looking and checking, which in the heat of battle and in the heat of combat you can't do very often, then indeed your hand can't feel whether you're striking with the sharp edge or the blunt edge if you've only got one edge. So if you have some projection only on one side of the sword, this is very advantageous in indexing the weapon so it's the correct way round. Indeed, when we formed the first batch of Royal Armourers swords, I was very drawn to this very unusual single-edged sword, which is in the Royal Armourers collection. And it looks at first sight like an arming sword. It looks like a broad arming sword, and it does have a symmetrical hilt. And I will tell you from experience, from bitter experience, when you draw this out without looking at it, indeed it is very easy to get it the wrong way round and therefore have a blunt back edge pointing towards what you're aiming to hit instead of the sharp edge. Indeed, the designers of this sword tried to mitigate that slightly by actually offsetting the grip. So you'll notice that the grip is more towards the blunt back than the sharp cutting edge. So that might assist somewhat, but I tell you, it doesn't assist an awful lot. If it had a lug or some projection on the side here, my hand, whether it's got a gauntlet on or not, would instantly feel which way round the sword was. As it is, you can't very easily, and it should be noted that these single-edged arming swords weren't historically very common or popular. We find them very occasionally. I think there's maybe about 3 surviving, but they are rare. Most arming swords are double-edged, even though to forge a double-edged blade, in fact I used the earlier Viking era example, to form a double-edged blade is a significant amount more work because you've got 2 edges to forge out. It takes you basically about twice as long as to make as a single edge blade. Not quite actually, but anyway, you get the idea. It takes you more time. So it's a lot more time and therefore money, cost, resources in terms of burning charcoal and this kind of thing. But they did it because of the advantages of having 2-edged swords. And I'm not saying those are the only advantages, there are other ones, and I have looked at those in past videos. I'm sure we'll talk about that in the future. I also want you finally to consider this in the heat of the moment, in the heat of battle issue. If we're looking at medieval knights, men-at-arms, soldiers of all sorts, in Western Europe in the medieval period, they were comparatively heavily armoured a lot of the time. Certainly in the late medieval period, where you've got full facial protection like this, you often can't look down when you're drawing your weapon out. So I've made this point in the past about the rondel dagger, that the rondel dagger, the discs are there for many reasons, but one of those is it's very easy to find the grip, get the weapon out and keep a grip on the weapon. So it's, without having to look at it, it's a very secure grip to index. I've also made this point in the past about wheel pommels, and I know some people hate them, some people love them, but the fact is that that is one of the most secure types of pommel that you can find without looking at it and not lose your grip on and easily get the weapon out in the heat of the moment when you need it. So when we're wearing lots of armour, if we're in full plate and we've got enclosed faces and we can't really see our weapons down here, if you can feel them, if you can index them, if you can get the edge the right way around, it's a huge advantage. And even if we're looking at the earlier medieval period where you've just got a mail hauberk and a nasal helmet, in that era you've got a large shield like the Norman kite shield behind me there. So indeed, that gets in your way, you're in a mass of people, it's not always convenient, safe, or within your interest to be looking down and going, which way round does this sword go? So having a double-edged symmetrical sword goes together, and if you have a sword which is single-edged, ideally you need it to have an asymmetrical hilt so that your hand alone, without having to look at it, can index it and get it the right way round when you need it to be. I hope that's been thought-provoking and useful. I'll see you down on the comments. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.